There is a transcript at the United States Navy Department Library, 16 pages long, that was typed up in Tokyo on October 18, 1945. The man being interrogated was a permanent officer of the Imperial Japanese Navy named Atsushi Oi. He had spent the last 23 months of the war as a staff officer of what the Japanese called the Combined Escort Fleet, the organization charged with protecting Japan's merchant shipping. He had watched the catastrophe ship by ship. The American officer across the table was Captain Stedman Teller. The transcript would be filed as Interrogation Naval Number 11 of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, and it would sit in the archives, mostly unread, for the next 80 years. What Oi told Teller in that room was not new to anyone who had been in the Pacific during the war. The submarines had been the worst of it, not the carriers, not the air raids on Tokyo. The submarines. They came in close, fired in the dark, and disappeared. Japanese sonar could not find them. Japanese aircraft could not catch them. Japanese intelligence could predict, sometimes, where they would appear, but the prediction never seemed to matter because the submarines were always somewhere else. By the spring of 1945, the convoy routes between Japan and the southern resource areas had been abandoned, one stretch of ocean at a time, because there was no longer any point in sailing ships through them. Whatever sailed, sank. Oi was asked, near the start of the session, who had been responsible for protecting Japanese shipping during the war. His answer is the most quietly damning sentence in the entire transcript. He said that responsibility had been split among the Army, the Navy, the Transportation Department, and the Munitions Department, and that no single person had ever held it. He then described, in careful technical English, an institution that had spent the entire war trying to assemble itself out of the wreckage of decisions made years before the first shot was fired. He had, he told Teller almost in passing, a number of figures committed to memory that he could give if asked: tonnages, convoy schedules, loss percentages by month. Teller asked him to slow down. The transcript shows the interrogator stopping the session twice that afternoon to confirm numbers. By the time the session ended, the typed pages held an institutional autopsy more complete than anything the Imperial Japanese Navy had been able to produce while the war was still going on. This is not a story about a battle. It is a story about a country that built the wrong navy. Japan went into the Pacific War with one of the most professionally accomplished surface fleets in the world, equipped with the finest torpedoes any nation possessed and crewed by men who had trained for 2 decades to fight a single, decisive engagement. By the standards Japan had set for itself, the early months of the war went almost exactly to plan. The strike on Pearl Harbor crippled the American battleship line. The Japanese seized the Philippines, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and the resource-rich South. The Battle of the Java Sea destroyed an Allied surface force in a single afternoon. The first 6 months of the Pacific War were, by the metrics of the Imperial Japanese Navy's pre-war doctrine, a triumph. And none of it mattered, because under the surface of that ocean, a smaller, less glamorous American force was already doing what no Japanese planner had ever taken seriously. They were sinking the freighters, the tankers, the transports, the unarmed working ships that kept an empire fed and fueled. By the time Japan understood the war it was actually fighting, the merchant fleet that had floated the empire was on the bottom of the Pacific, and Captain Oi was being driven across Tokyo for an interrogation he could not refuse. To understand how that happened, you have to begin not with Pearl Harbor, and not with the launch of the first American fleet submarine. You have to begin with a quiet decision made inside the Japanese naval staff in the years immediately after the Russo-Japanese War, a decision so foundational that almost nobody who made it would live to see what it cost. In May 1905, in the strait between Korea and Japan, Admiral Togo Heihachiro destroyed the Russian Baltic Fleet at the Battle of Tsushima. The Russians lost most of their battle line. All 11 of their battleships were sunk or captured. Only 3 Russian ships, a cruiser and 2 destroyers, reached Vladivostok out of the entire fleet. Japanese losses came to 3 torpedo boats and 117 dead. The Imperial Japanese Navy, in a single afternoon, had become one of the great fighting forces of the world. The lesson the Japanese drew from that afternoon would shape every shipbuilding decision they made for the next 4 decades. The man who turned the lesson into doctrine was Captain, later Admiral, Sato Tetsutaro. He had read the writings of the American naval theorist Alfred Thayer Mahan closely, and he adapted the central argument for Japan. Mahan had said that sea power was won by destroying the enemy's main fleet in a single decisive battle. Sato published his own version in a treatise titled History of Imperial Defense in 1908. The doctrine took its formal name from the Japanese phrase Kantai Kessen, which translates as fleet decisive battle. Its logic was elegant. Japan was a smaller country with smaller industrial capacity. It could not match the United States ship for ship, so it would not try. It would let the Americans cross the Pacific, wear them down with submarines and light forces along the way, and then, in waters Japan had chosen, meet the depleted American battle line and annihilate it. The shipbuilding programs of the 1920s and 1930s were built around this theory: battleships, heavy cruisers, destroyers carrying the long lance torpedo, the most lethal underwater weapon any navy possessed. Aircraft carriers, eventually, when naval aviation became too important to ignore. What Mahan had also said, and what Sato had quietly skipped over, was that sea power was about commerce, that a maritime nation lived and died by its merchant marine, that destroying an enemy's commerce was as decisive in its way as destroying his fleet. The British in 2 world wars would prove the point. The Germans, in their submarine campaigns in the Atlantic, would prove the inverse of it. But the Japanese, looking at their own doctrine through the lens of Tsushima and the samurai tradition, decided that commerce protection was a defensive duty, and defensive duties were beneath the dignity of a fighting navy. There is a kind of contempt that runs through Japanese naval writing of the period whenever the subject of anti-submarine warfare comes up. The thinking was that the problem was simple, common sense. It did not require special study. It did not require dedicated ships. A samurai's sword, the implicit argument went, was for cutting down the enemy in battle, not for guarding rice merchants on the road from Edo. So when Japan began planning for war with the United States in the late 1930s, the question of how the empire would protect the steady stream of oil tankers, ore carriers, food ships, and troop transports that would have to sail thousands of miles to keep it alive, received almost no serious attention. The first dedicated coastal escort vessels, a class of small ships called kaibokan, had been authorized only in 1937, and only 4 ships of that initial class were actually built. The first wartime expansion, 30 modified escorts of the Etorofu class, was not authorized until late 1941, almost on the eve of Pearl Harbor itself, and most of those ships would not enter service until well into 1943. The pre-war Japanese estimate had been that the country needed approximately 5.9 million long tons of merchant shipping to maintain its economy and its military during a major war. At the time of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese merchant fleet had a capacity of about 6.4 million tons. The margin was almost nothing, and the Navy, charged with defending it, had spent 40 years preparing for a different war entirely. Across the Pacific, the United States Navy had spent those same 40 years arguing with itself about what its submarines were for. The American submarine force in 1941 was small, professionally cohesive, and in a state of low simmering frustration. The official doctrine of the Navy held that submarines existed to scout for the main battle fleet, find the enemy, report his position, and engage warships at long range. The submariners had never accepted this. They had been arguing for years that their boats were commerce raiders, that their proper targets were merchant ships and tankers, and that the Navy's pre-war doctrine was, in the politest possible institutional language, nonsense. The argument had gone nowhere. The American government, in the period between the wars, had publicly committed itself to the principle that unrestricted submarine warfare against merchant shipping was a war crime. The London Naval Treaty of 1930 had codified the position. American diplomats had pointed at the German submarine campaign of 1917 as the moral collapse of modern naval warfare. American admirals had given speeches saying that civilized fleets did not torpedo civilians without warning. All of this changed in less than 5 hours on December 7, 1941. While the wreckage at Pearl Harbor was still smoking, Admiral Harold Stark, the Chief of Naval Operations in Washington, transmitted a 6-word order at 5:52 in the afternoon Washington time: execute against Japan unrestricted air and submarine warfare. The decision was older than the day it was sent. Naval planners had quietly drafted it through 1940 and into 1941, behind closed doors, in anticipation of exactly the kind of attack Japan had just delivered. Pearl Harbor did not produce the order. It only produced the political conditions that allowed the order to leave the building. By that night, every American submarine commander in the Pacific had been authorized to do to Japan what the Germans had once done to Britain: sink anything Japanese. On sight, without warning. The submariners were ready in spirit. They were not ready in equipment. The first 18 months of the submarine war against Japan would become, in retrospect, one of the most painful institutional failures in the history of the United States Navy. The cause had a single name. It was the Mark 14 torpedo and the men who fired it. The Mark 14 was the standard American submarine torpedo at the start of the war. It was meant to do 3 things: run at a set depth, detonate by direct contact with the enemy hull, or, more cleverly, detect the magnetic field beneath the keel of an enemy ship and explode underneath it where the armor was thinnest. It did none of these reliably. It ran roughly 10 feet deeper than its set depth, so that it slid harmlessly beneath its target. The magnetic exploder, a delicate device designed in the 1920s and live tested only once before the war against an obsolete submarine, the USS L8, would trigger early from the Earth's own magnetic field and detonate before reaching the target. And on the rare occasion when a torpedo did manage to run at the correct depth and strike its target, the contact firing pin had been so badly engineered that on a perfect 90-degree hit, it would crush against the hull and fail to detonate. The better the shot, the less likely it was to explode. There is a war diary entry from one of those early submarines that survives in the archives, written in the calm, professional language American officers used for documents they expected their superiors to read. It described the experience of crossing thousands of miles of hostile ocean to reach an attack position within a few hundred yards of an enemy ship, only to find that the torpedoes ran deep and over half the time failed to function. The diarist suggested, with the dryness of a man who has been pushed past anger into something colder, that this seemed an undesirable method of gaining information that could be obtained any morning within a few miles of a torpedo station, with comparatively few hazards. The man who wrote that sentence had been sent across an ocean to die for nothing. The senior officer who finally broke the situation open was Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, who had taken over as commander of submarines in the Pacific in February of 1943. Lockwood had been at war with the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington for over a year by then, trying to get the Bureau to admit that the torpedoes were defective. The Bureau had blamed everything else first. Maintenance, crew error, captains exaggerating their reports. They had even sent an investigator to Australia who, after a few days at the Fremantle submarine base, wrote up a report blaming the entire problem on poor seamanship. Lockwood, by then, had stopped waiting for Washington. He ran his own tests. The most famous of them happened in late August of 1943 off the volcanic cliffs of Kahula'a Island in Hawaii, where his men fired live warshots at the cliff face and recovered the torpedoes that had failed to detonate. They dropped dummy warheads filled with sand from a crane 90 feet onto a steel plate to see how the firing pins behaved on impact. 7 out of 10 of them bent or jammed. The depth tests, run by firing torpedoes through fishing nets, showed Mark 14s running 10 to 15 feet below their set depth, depending on the warhead. The breaking moment came earlier that summer. On July 24, 1943, Lieutenant Commander Lawrence Daspit, commanding the submarine USS Tinosa, had found a Japanese tanker named Tonan Maru No. 3 drifting nearly stationary in the Pacific. She displaced just under 20,000 tons. Daspit fired 15 torpedoes at her in slow, deliberate shots, with the target's broadside fully exposed at point-blank range. 11 of them hit. 1 detonated. He saved his last torpedo, took it back to Pearl Harbor, and handed it to Lockwood as evidence. Even now, reading Daspit's patrol report, you can feel the rage in the careful neutrality of the prose. By June 24 of that year, Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander of the entire Pacific Fleet, had heard enough and ordered all submarines under his direct command to deactivate the magnetic exploders. There was one holdout. Rear Admiral Ralph Christie, commanding the submarines based out of Australia, had personally helped design the magnetic exploder back in the 1920s. He refused to disable it. It would take a direct order from Vice Admiral Thomas Kincaid, the new commander of Allied naval forces in the Southwest Pacific, before Christie's boats finally complied in January of 1944. Christie wrote in his diary on the day he gave in, "Today the long, hard battle on the Mark VI magnetic feature ends with defeat. I am forced to inactivate all magnetic exploders. We are licked." By September of 1943, 21 months into the war, all three major defects of the Mark XIV torpedo had been identified and fixed. Aluminum machined from the propellers of Japanese aircraft shot down at Pearl Harbor was being used to replace the heavy firing pin blocks that had bent on impact. The exact cost of those 21 months is impossible to calculate cleanly. It included an unknown number of Japanese ships that had limped home after being struck by torpedoes that simply would not function, and the 14 American submarines that had been lost on patrol before the end of 1943, men whose families would never know whether their sons died because the enemy had been better, or because the weapons they had carried into combat had been broken from the day they left the factory. The Japanese, watching all this from their side of the war, did not understand what was happening. They saw American torpedoes hitting their ships and not exploding. They concluded that American submarines were inept and that American technology was inferior. They did not understand that the United States submarine force was about to receive working torpedoes for the first time. They did not understand that a war they thought they were winning was about to invert. By the late summer of 1943, the picture had changed completely. The torpedoes worked. The submariners had 18 months of hard combat experience behind them. New boats of the Gato and Balao classes were arriving in the Pacific in growing numbers, with longer endurance, better radar, and improved fire control systems. And a generation of submarine commanders who had been waiting their entire careers for a real war was finally taking command of those boats. One of them was a Naval Academy graduate from Washington named Eugene Fluckey. He took command of the submarine USS Barb in late April 1944. By the end of his time aboard her, 15 months later, he had sunk 17 Japanese ships totaling more than 96,000 tons, including the escort carrier Unyo. He would receive the Medal of Honor and 4 Navy Crosses. The action that earned him the Medal of Honor remains one of the strangest set pieces in the entire submarine war. By January 1945, Fluckey had been studying Japanese convoy patterns in the China Sea for weeks. He had concluded that the Japanese, under increasing pressure from American air attacks and submarine ambushes in deep water, had begun anchoring their convoys in shallow Chinese harbors at night and hugging the coast in daylight, where the water was too shallow for an American submarine to dive. His response, in a sentence, was to follow them in. On the night of January 22, 1945, the Barb threaded her way into Namkwan Harbor on the Chinese coast. She was inside what Japan considered a controlled inland anchorage. She was riding in 5 fathoms of water, 30 feet, in a boat that needed at least 60 feet of depth to dive. 2 convoys lay at anchor in front of her, 27 ships in all, 11 escorts and 16 tankers and freighters and transports. Behind her was a Japanese minefield and a screen of patrol aircraft. If she fired, she could not retreat by submerging. She would have to run on the surface, at top speed, for over an hour through uncharted, mined, rock-studded water before she could reach the depth she needed. Fluckey fired anyway. At 04:02 on the morning of January 23, from a range of 3,000 yards, he launched all 6 bow torpedoes at the mass of anchored ships, then turned the Barb hard and fired all 4 stern tubes. 8 torpedoes hit 6 targets. An ammunition ship in the middle of the harbor exploded with such force that flying shells lit the sky for miles. The Barb ran for open water at over 23 knots, the fastest a fleet submarine had ever moved on the surface, with 2 Japanese frigates and a patrol aircraft pursuing. None of her crew was wounded. None of her crew was killed. 4 days later, Fluckey sank another Japanese freighter on the way home, almost as if to underline a point. There was no order from above to do what Fluckey did at Namkwan. There was no doctrine in any United States Navy manual that authorized a submarine commander to take his boat into a defended enemy anchorage in 5 fathoms of water and fire on shipping at point-blank range. He had looked at the situation and decided what the situation required, and he was not unique. He was not even the most successful American submarine commander of the war. That distinction belonged to Lieutenant Commander Richard Hetherington O'Kane of the submarine USS Tang, a New Hampshire man who in 1944 sank 24 Japanese ships in 5 war patrols before his own boat was destroyed by one of its own circular running torpedoes off the coast of Formosa. O'Kane survived, was taken prisoner, and would receive his own Medal of Honor after the war ended. There was Dudley Morton of the submarine USS Wahoo, a Kentucky-born commander who pioneered aggressive surface attack tactics before he and his entire crew were lost in October of 1943 while exiting the Sea of Japan. There was Samuel Dealey of the USS Harder, the man known throughout the submarine service as the destroyer killer, who attacked 5 Japanese destroyers in 5 separate engagements off the Philippines in June 1944. Post-war analysis credited him with 4 destroyers definitely sunk and a 5th likely. Harder herself was lost 2 months later off Dassol Bay with all hands. These men were not the products of any pre-war doctrine. They were the products of a service that had learned, painfully, to trust its commanders. The American submarine force had developed a culture in which a boat captain was given an objective and a patrol area and was then expected to figure out how to produce results. There were no detailed orders from headquarters about which targets to attack or which tactics to use. There were patrol summaries, debriefed in person by Lockwood himself when he could manage it, lessons quietly traded between submarine wardrooms in Pearl Harbor and Fremantle and Midway, and a steady accumulation of operational knowledge passed from skipper to skipper that no Japanese anti-submarine officer ever fully grasped from the outside. By the spring of 1944, the pattern was set. American submarines were sinking Japanese ships faster than Japanese yards could replace them. The Japanese response was a bureaucratic disaster of the kind that almost defies recounting in a calm voice. The Combined Escort Fleet, the organization that was supposed to protect Japanese shipping, had been organized only on November 15, 1943, after almost 2 years of war, in response to losses around the Bismarck Islands that had become impossible to ignore. Its first commander was Admiral Koshiro Oikawa, a former Navy minister, who had no operational background in commerce protection, because nobody senior in the Imperial Japanese Navy had any operational background in commerce protection. When Oikawa took command, his entire operational force amounted to roughly 50 ships, most of them obsolete. The destroyers among them were first-generation Minakaze and Momi-class boats laid down between 1917 and 1925. He had 4 escort carriers nominally assigned to him, but all 4 were in shipyards undergoing extensive repairs, and the first of them did not actually join a convoy until July of 1944. By that point, 2/3 of the war was already lost. The dedicated anti-submarine air component, the 901st Air Group, was not organized until December of 1943 at Tateyama, on the eastern coast of Honshu. Its commanding officer, Captain Sukamitsu Kamida, told his American interrogators after the war that the unit had been built with whatever aircraft could be spared, regardless of whether those aircraft were suited to anti-submarine work. Most of them were medium bombers pressed into a role they had never been designed for. The Japanese did develop a magnetic anomaly detector, a piece of equipment carried in aircraft that could sense the steel hull of a submerged submarine from above. They called it the Type 3 Mark I, sometimes referred to by the abbreviation KMX. They put it into operational use in the spring of 1944. Its effective detection range was about 150 meters under average conditions, and the aircraft carrying it had to fly between 10 and 50 meters above the sea surface to use it at all. Even with experienced operators and equipment in good condition, the maximum range was about 280 meters. Compare that to the cruising range of an American Gato-class submarine, more than 11,000 miles, and the scale of the mismatch begins to be visible. Japan was trying to find one needle at a time in an ocean 9,000 miles wide, and the country had only a handful of working detectors. Captain Kamide was asked, in his post-war interrogation, whether anti-submarine warfare had been given a low priority by the Japanese High Command in the early years of the war. He answered simply that it had not been considered of great importance. Only at the end of 1943, with the shipping losses becoming undeniable, had the Navy attempted to expand the air group's strength. By then, the United States submarine force was no longer just sinking Japanese ships, it was sinking them faster than Japan could build them. The numbers are worth pausing over, because they were what the Japanese officers in those interrogation rooms had watched accumulate, month after month, during the war. In peacetime, Japan had imported about 67 million tons of materials into the home islands per year. By 1942, with the war on, that figure had already dropped to 35 million tons. By 1943, it was 27 million. By 1944, 16 million. The Strategic Bombing Survey, going through Japanese Army records after the war, found that 17% of all Army supplies shipped from Japan had been sunk in 1943, 30% had been sunk in 1944. By 1945, the figure was 50%. 1 in every 2 ships carrying ammunition or food or replacement troops to a Japanese garrison was being sent to the bottom before it arrived. Tanker losses were even worse. Oil imports into the home islands had been 1.75 million barrels a month in August of 1943. By July of 1944, that figure had dropped to 360,000 barrels a month, less than a quarter of what the Japanese economy needed. During the last 15 months of the war, only about 9% of the oil shipped out of the southern resource zones actually reached Japan. The last tanker from Southeast Asia made it through to a Japanese port in March of 1945. After that, nothing. The reports of Japanese officers at every level of the escort organization, when read together, described the same experience from 100 different angles. Lieutenant Commander Noriteru Yatsui had been navigation officer of the Japanese cruiser Oi, a coincidence of names with the captain whose interrogation opened this story, when she was torpedoed and sunk in the South China Sea on July 19, 1944. Yatsui survived and was reassigned to the staff of the 7th Escort Convoy. In his interrogation, he described an escort organization that had been forced to rely on radar that did not work well, on operators who had not been trained well enough to use it, and on too few aircraft. The escorts had statistical intelligence about where American submarines were likely to appear, and could even predict the temperament of particular wolfpacks, whether a given group was aggressive or cautious. None of it changed the outcome. The submarines kept arriving, the convoys kept getting hit, the losses kept mounting. There was another officer, Lieutenant Commander Shisei Yasumoto, a regular naval officer with 7 years of service who had commanded the escort vessel Shiokaze before being moved to the staff of the 103rd Convoy Escort Squadron. In his post-war interrogation, the American summary of his testimony noted that he had been particularly impressed by the way American submarines had operated offensively in very restricted waters, the kind of shallow seas and narrow channels where, by every Japanese textbook of anti-submarine warfare, a submarine should not have been able to function at all. Yasumoto was describing, without quite saying so, what Eugene Fluckey had done at Namkwan Harbor. He was describing the willingness of an entire submarine force to take its boats into water where Japanese doctrine had assumed they would never go. What is most striking about these interrogations, when you read them now, is the absence of the explanations one might expect. The Japanese officers do not blame American luck. They do not blame the atomic bomb. They do not blame the carrier raids of late 1944, devastating as those raids were. What they keep returning to, in answer after answer, is the same image. The submarines, which would not stop, which they could not find with their sonar, could not catch with their aircraft, and could not predict with their intelligence, which kept arriving in the same waters night after night, year after year, until there was nothing left to escort. Now look at the same months from the American side. By late 1944, the United States submarine force in the Pacific was running coordinated wolfpack operations, multiple submarines attacking the same convoy under the loose command of a senior officer aboard one of the boats. The packs had names that became famous within the service. Lauchlin's Loopers, The group containing the Queenfish, the Pecuda, and Fluckey's Barb ran the patrol that ended at Namkwan Harbor. Donahoe's group, Donk's Devils, Park's Pirates. They were not the only ones. By that point, there were dozens of such operations going simultaneously in shallow water off Formosa, in the Yellow Sea, in the East China Sea. Behind them, an even quieter operation was running. American codebreakers in Hawaii, working from intercepted Japanese naval traffic in a program code named Ultra, were reading Japanese convoy movement orders, sometimes hours before the Japanese convoys themselves received the signal. The information was passed to submarine commanders at sea with extreme caution, scrubbed of any detail that might tell the Japanese the source had been compromised. By the second half of 1944, an American submarine waiting in the South China Sea might know the position, course, speed, and cargo of a Japanese convoy before that convoy's escort commander had finished reading the orders himself. In June of 1945, an operation called Barney sent 9 American submarines, organized into 3 subgroups under Commander Earl Heidman, aboard the USS Sea Dog, into the Sea of Japan itself. Until that month, the Sea of Japan had been considered a Japanese inland lake, secured by minefields in the Tsushima Strait that nobody believed a submarine could pass through alive. The Barney boats passed through anyway, using a newly developed kind of high-frequency sonar called FM sonar, sometimes called Hell's Bells by the men who operated it, that could identify mines in the water by their acoustic signature. The 9 boats sank 27 Japanese ships in less than 3 weeks before withdrawing through La Perouse Strait to the north. One of the 9, the USS Bonefish, did not come out. She was sunk by Japanese surface attack on June 19, 1945, with her commander, Commander Lawrence Edge, and her crew of 85 aboard. She was the last American submarine lost in the war. By August of 1945, the Japanese merchant fleet that had begun the war at 6.4 million tons had been reduced to about 1.5 million tons, much of it useless because there was no fuel to operate it and no escorts to protect it. The total Japanese merchant tonnage lost during the war is variously calculated, but most authoritative sources place it at around 8.6 million long tons. American submarines, alone, had sunk 130-plus Japanese warships, totaling more than 540,000 tons, and well over 1,000 Japanese merchant vessels totaling about 4.78 million tons. By the official tally, submarines accounted for 54.6% of all Japanese vessels destroyed, naval and merchant combined, in any way, by any cause. They sank, by themselves, more Japanese tonnage than the carrier air groups, the land-based bombers, the surface fleet, and the mining campaigns put together. And they did it with a force that comprised at peak strength about 1.5% of the United States Navy's total personnel. If anyone in your family served on a submarine in the Pacific War, on any boat, in any role, I would consider it an honor to read their story in the comments below. The American submarine force of 1941 to 1945 suffered the highest casualty rate of any branch of the United States military. Of the roughly 16,000 men who went out on war patrol, 3,500 never came back, 22%. Their stories are not always in the official histories. Many of them are still carried only by the families they returned to, or by the families of the men who did not return at all. Those details, the small, specific personal things, matter more than any archive. There is one more piece of the submarine war that should be on the record before this story goes any further. From 1943 onward, Admiral Lockwood operated a parallel program that the submariners themselves came to call the Lifeguard League. American submarines, during major air operations, were stationed at known points along the routes the bombers and carrier aircraft would fly, with orders to surface and pick up any aviator they could reach who had gone into the water. Over the course of the war, those submarines pulled more than 500 American airmen out of the Pacific, sometimes from within sight of Japanese coastlines. A future president of the United States, Lieutenant Junior Grade George Bush, was one of them. He had been shot down off Chichijima on September 2, 1944, and was retrieved from his life raft by the submarine USS Finback under the command of Lieutenant Commander Robert Williams. Bush, who was 20 years old at the time and had 2 crewmates who did not get out of the aircraft, would spend the next 30 days aboard the Finback, standing lookout watches, before he was put ashore at Midway. The submariners who came aboard their boats from those rescues were not always Navy. Some were Army Air Forces. Many of them had never been on a submarine before. The boats took them in, fed them, gave them a bunk if there was one, and carried them home. None of this changed the strategic calculus of the Pacific War, but it is part of what the men in those pressure hulls were doing during the war that broke Japan. In the autumn of 1945, while American B-29s were still flying photographic reconnaissance over the wreckage of Japanese cities, the team of officers under Captain Stedman Teller began conducting the interrogations that would eventually become the Naval Analysis Division of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. The work would fill 2 thick volumes. Captain Oi was Naval Number 11. Lieutenant Commander Yatsui was Number 37. Lieutenant Commander Yasumoto was Number 45. Captain Kamide was Number 74. Atsushi Oi alone would be questioned in detail across multiple sessions about Japanese shipping losses, escort organization, convoy doctrine, and what Japan had tried, and failed, to do about American submarines. The pattern of those answers, when read together now, is unmistakable. Oi, asked to identify the single greatest cause of Japanese shipping losses during the war, said simply that submarines had been the most dangerous weapon. He elaborated when pressed, but only technically, on tonnage and percentages. He had no need for emotion. Yatsui, asked about the most serious losses during the autumn of 1944, said that in his own opinion the loss of fuel had been the gravest blow to the country, and that the loss of aviation gasoline shipped in drums during the emergency transportation of November and December of that year had been particularly damaging. The aviation gasoline that was supposed to fuel the kamikaze attacks could not even reach the airfields because the tankers carrying it had been torpedoed. Kamide, asked to name the outstanding Japanese anti-submarine development of the war, named the magnetic anomaly detector and improved radar. Both, he acknowledged, had come too late and existed in numbers too small to make any real difference. He gave the answer without bitterness, the way a professional gives a professional answer when there is no point left in arguing. There is a moment in another of those interrogations, conducted with a senior officer who had worked at the operational level on convoy planning, where the American interrogator asks why a comprehensive Japanese convoy system had not been adopted earlier in the war. The answer, when it comes, is less a justification than something closer to a confession. The Navy, the officer explains, had been preoccupied with offensive operations. The escort role, the protection role, was not where careers were built or where battles were won. By the time it became visible as the place where the war was being lost, it was too late to construct the ships, train the crews, or develop the doctrine that would have made any meaningful difference. The doctrine of decisive battle had been the soul of the Imperial Japanese Navy for 40 years. It had given the Navy its purpose, its prestige, and its self-image. And at the end, it had blinded the Navy to the war it was actually fighting. So here is the honest answer to the question this story set out to address. Why did Japan never find a way to stop the submarines? Because Japan had built a navy designed to fight a different war. The Imperial Japanese Navy was an institution of immense skill, deep tradition, and genuine professional competence. Its officers were brave, its sailors were disciplined, and its equipment, in particular categories like its surface torpedoes and its night fighting tactics, was the equal or the superior of anything the Americans put to sea. What it had not done, and what it could no longer do once the war was already underway, was build the second navy that a maritime empire actually requires, the escort navy, the convoy navy, the unglamorous, patient, ship-by-ship organization that protects the tankers and the freighters and the ore carriers, without which no war machine can keep running for very long. The Americans had not started the war with that second navy either. But the Americans had something else. They had a small, professionally cohesive submarine force that had spent 20 years preparing for commerce warfare in defiance of its own official doctrine. They had a command system that pushed authority down to the boat captains and trusted them, even at heavy cost, to use it. They had an industrial base that delivered new submarines and new equipment in a flow Japan could not begin to match. And once the torpedoes worked, in the late summer of 1943, they had a weapon for which the Japanese had no answer, and would never develop one. The verdict on the Pacific War, the honest one, is not that Japan lost because the Americans were braver or the Japanese were less skilled. It is that Japan lost because Japan had bet everything on a single decisive battle that it never got to fight, while the Americans were quietly, methodically, and at heavy cost in their own submariners' lives, fighting a different war entirely. By the time Tokyo understood which war was actually being fought, the merchant fleet that fed the empire was on the bottom of the Pacific. The names in this account belong to real men whose service is documented in the archival record of the United States Navy. Atsushi Oi served on the staff of the Combined Escort Fleet from November 1943 until the war ended, and his interrogation transcript, Naval Number 11, can still be read in the historical archives of the Strategic Bombing Survey. Eugene Fluckey commanded the Barb on her 11th war patrol, exactly as it has been described here. Lawrence Daspit's 15 torpedoes against Tonanmaru No. 3 are documented in the war diary of the USS Tinosa for July 24, 1943. Charles Lockwood, Ralph Christie, Thomas Kincaid, Chester Nimitz, Harold Stark, Richard O'Kane, Dudley Morton, Samuel Dealey, Lawrence Edge, Earl Heidman. They are all there, in the patrol reports and the official histories and the memorial pages of the United States Navy. Some of them came home. 3 of the boat commanders named here did not. The crews of 52 American submarines lost on patrol in the Pacific are still on patrol, in the language the submarine service uses for boats lost with all hands. The men who served in those boats came from places the histories rarely list: small towns in Iowa and Indiana, harbor neighborhoods in Boston and Brooklyn, farms in Georgia, tool shops in Ohio, mining counties in West Virginia. Most of them never told their stories, because the stories were classified for years after the war, and because the men, when the war ended, mostly just wanted to go home. The ones who came home went back to ordinary work. The ones who did not are buried in places marked on no chart, in waters their families could never visit. They built, in the years they did not live to see, the country their submarines had won the time for. Atsushi Oi was sent home from Tokyo a few weeks after his interrogation. He continued to write about Japanese anti-submarine warfare, including a long technical essay he published in the United States Naval Institute Proceedings in June of 1952, under the title Why Japan's Anti-Submarine Warfare Failed. He laid the case out plainly, in measured English, with the same calm clarity he had used in front of Captain Teller 7 years earlier. His account has not been seriously revised in 80 years, because there is nothing serious in it to revise. What he understood, and what almost no one in his country had understood in time, was that the men in the pressure hulls had never been a sideshow. They had been the war. If this story gave you something to think about, hit the like button. It tells YouTube to put this work in front of the people who care about the history that actually happened, with the names and the documents and the dates intact. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. There are many of these stories. Most of them are about men who did dangerous, patient, unglamorous work in places where no camera ever reached, and who deserve to be remembered for the thing about them that the enemy, in the end, never figured out how to defeat.